Hi everyone, welcome back to Novel Nomad and welcome to my TBR for April, which is going to be highly inspired by the hashtag Aussie April Readathon, which is hosted by none other than Jaclyn from 6 Minutes for Me and Doris from Older Books. They have created a really fun readathon just to infuse some Aussie fiction into your reading lineup for April. There is really chill and easy. It goes for the entire month of April and there are really only 2 prompts with 2 bonus prompts. The first one is to read a new release Australian fiction, and I have gone for the second in the Cormac McCarthy series by Dalton The Scholar. Now the first one was The Ruin. You've probably seen me absolutely adore that book in my Cloak and Dagger Christmas readathon in December last year, but I cannot wait to get into this book. It is a very fresh new release. I am super duper excited for it, and I just can't wait to get into it. I haven't read anything into it, so I can't really explain too much of the blurb. I'll link it down below though, because I want to go into it blind. I want to be absolutely swept away by how brilliant Dervla McTiernan's writing is. So I absolutely love The Ruin. It is a really fantastic crime fiction, and if the second book is anywhere as good as the first, it is going to be brilliant. But of course, if you haven't read the first Ruin, which you can, 2 books that are new releases that you could possibly pick up, and it also is to do things that you've seen on booktube and which I have reviewed, so you could use me as your reference, and that is Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton. This is receiving a lot of hype and it is a really beautiful coming of age story for a young boy in 1980s Brisbane. And the other one is The Children's House. This is a really beautiful story about a family and coming together and finding a concept of family between strangers, and it is set in New York, but it is absolutely beautifully written. So those 2 I absolutely recommend for prompt number 1 if you want to get some Aussie fiction into your TBR. So prompt number 2 is an Aussie author that you've been meaning to get to, and I'm adding 2 to my TBR for this one. One is going to be Leanne Hearn, her book Across the Nightingale Floor, which is set in more of a medieval Japan, and I've been recommended this one by a lovely co-worker at the bookshop I work at, and she has been absolutely inspirational for my love of getting into this series. I cannot wait to start it. If it is half as good as what she says it is, just going to knock it out of the park. Brilliant. So I really can't wait to read Leanne Hearn's Across the Nightingale Floor, and it's about ninjas in medieval Japan. Like, come on, that's amazing. Next is going to be All That I Am by Anna Funda. Anna Funda grew up in Melbourne and Paris and now lives in Sydney, and this is a World War II historical fiction. Needless to say, it is my bread and butter. I am very much ready to read this one, and I have been putting it off for so long. I really need to read it. I think there's just so much hype surrounding this book, and this book came out in 2011 and there is still continuing hype for it. It is just a book that clearly stays with the reader. It is one that constantly is being recommended, so I am really very desperate to get into it. And it also was the winner of the Miles Franklin Award, which is a literary award within Australia, and it is about a group of friends who basically, as soon as Hitler comes to power in 1993, become outlaws for their beliefs. And this is coinciding with another narrative of a woman in 2007 Sydney who is trying to grapple with the ghosts of her past. So this sounds like my bread and butter. Like I said, this sounds absolutely brilliant and I cannot wait to get to it. So some recommendations that you might want to check out to add to your Aussie April TBR could possibly be The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart. This is a reasonably new release for Australian fiction, and it is more of a historical fiction set in the Victorian era about a young girl who really is having trouble getting to grips with her place in society, and then she's sent to live with her grandmother, who actually runs an Australian native flower farm. And of course, within Victorian era, all flowers have meanings, and she starts to slowly discover the meaning to her own life and person as well. So this sounds absolutely gorgeous, and it comes highly recommended by Kate Howe, and I always trust her recommendation. Next, you've probably heard of Kristoff. He is quite a well-known Australian YA author, but you might not have read his book Lifelike. It is a standalone one. He writes a lot with Amy Kaufman in the Illuminae Chronicles, but he also has wrote Nevernight, which was his own creation. And this one is a bit of a really intensely awesome read because it's a bit cyberpunk with a bit Mad Max with a bit of everything else chucked in, and the ending blew me away. It was ridiculous, but it was so fantastically good. So if you haven't read any of his books, I know he's a well-known author on booktube, maybe you could get those off your shelf. And another recommendation is Shaun Tan. Now this is more of a picture book recommendation, so if say you did a middle grade March and you want to go into more of the picture books leading into April, I highly recommend Shaun Tan. His picture books are so beautiful and the stories behind them are so deep and meaningful. It just makes reading them a joy, not just for children but for adults as well. So Tales from Outer Suburbia was one of his very first collections that he released, and it is absolutely beautiful. It's different odd stories about different weird crazy things happening in suburban Australia, and it just makes it that bit more magical and all these little explorations. Another book of his that I absolutely adore is called The Arrival. It is no words, complete picture book, and it's about the struggles that refugees face when moving to a new country, because obviously sometimes they don't even understand the language or have a fluent grasp of the language of the place they're moving to. So it was amazingly telling, and it came from his own family past. And his latest release is Tales from the Inner City, which, like Tales from Out of Suburbia, this looks at more of the struggles and the lifestyle choices of inner city living. And it's, once again, the illustrations are just beautiful. You can see his style is greatly starting to change, but there is always this kind of simplicity and this space that he uses within his work, and it is stunning. It is just beautiful, and he always likes to include the weird, the odd, and the misunderstood within a very busy landscape. So I think these collections are absolutely lovely, and if you have never read Shaun Tan or you've heard of them and you really want to get to it, probably a great little interlude for April. Now, bonus prompt number 1 is basically to read a new release Australian fiction, but preferably if it comes from an Indigenous Australian author. Now, for this one, I will be reading Terra Nullius by Claire G. Coleman. Now, this one I saw on Leah from Hide and Seek's channel. I will link her down below. She reviewed this book and absolutely loved it, so I am absolutely keen to get into it. This is written by an Indigenous Australian author, and it is to do obviously with cultural identity and the identity of Australia that has greatly been taken away from the Indigenous community within Australia. So obviously an incredibly important book, and has received a lot of acclaim. Now, my recommendations for other Indigenous authors would absolutely be Alexis Wright, The Swan Book, and also Carpentaria. I really want to read Carpentaria. It sounds really amazing. I know Swan Book has got a bit of a love-hate relationship with lots of people on booktube and also within the reviewing community, because either you really understand and you like to just get lost within this kind of convoluted narrative, or it just loses the reader. So they are two that I recommend, and the other one is going to be Too Much Lip by Melissa Lukashenko. Now, she is actually nominated for the Stella Prize this year, her book. I don't have my copy on me. It is disappeared off to a friend's house because they wanted to borrow it straight away. But also highly recommend that one. It comes obviously talking more about Indigenous communities within Australia as well, and a really beautifully written piece. And she's been nominated for the Stella Prize for her other work as well. So they are two that I absolutely recommend. I'll link them down below so you can check them out even though you don't get to see them here. Bonus prompt number 2 is in relation to prompt number 2. It's to read an Australian author that you've been meaning to get to, but this one is to be nominated from the Stella Prize. Now, the Stella Prize has been running since 2013 and lists Australian non-fiction and fiction books written by Australian women. And I am going with The Museum of Modern Love by Heather Rose. This won the Stella Prize in 2017, and it sounds to be a really, really interesting view of love, life, and art, and how that is incorporated into the world and how people should view the artist. So it seems that the concept of the book was inspired by Marina Andropovic's The Artist is Present, where she sat in the atrium of MoMA and people could go up and sit and look at the artist. And I think that is a really fascinating concept, to take something that was so influential within the art community around the world and create a narrative of it. And I'm really excited to get into this book, and it is part of my book club's read, so it worked out perfectly for April. Other Stella Prize nominees or even winners I can recommend is definitely going to be The Eye of the Sheep by Sofia Laguna. You know I love this book. The character and the narration is so wonderful, but it is also brutally honest. It is a really beautiful but also has very dark moments, and it is excellent. I highly recommend. It would be a wonderful addition to any TBR for April. The next Stella recommendation I have is Maxine Beneba Clark. This is her short story collection, so it is wonderfully accessible. Each story is absolutely stunning. It is graphically moving in each story. It really touches your heart, and to have an author who can do that for an entire short story collection, not just one or two short stories that speak to you, is astounding. I loved her non-fiction, which is more of a memoir called The Hate Race. It was a really telling depiction of what it was like to be an African who was born and grew up in Australia but was always considered the other. And that continues today in the depiction of refugees within Australia, but it is a really important book, and this is a very important short story collection, and one that I cannot recommend enough. Alright, so that is hashtag Aussie April. Be sure to check out any of the books in the description down below, and tell me in the comments if you are participating or if you have a particularly favourite book written by an Aussie author or even set in Australia. So I hope you have a wonderful April and happy reading, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!